The contract came through on a Tuesday. I remember that because I'd been sitting on 3 weeks of nothing. And nothing has a particular quality to it when you're watching your checking account the way I was watching mine. Not with any real plan, just checking it the way you check a wound. Hoping it's better than you left it. It never is. The recruiter's name was somebody at a federal contracting firm out of Salt Lake, and I couldn't tell you his name now if you paid me. What I remember is what he said, which was that the work was routine legacy site documentation for a BLM subcontract in San Juan County, Utah. Routine. That was the word he used twice, maybe 3 times. I've thought about that a lot since. Whether he knew what he was sending me into, or whether he was just a guy reading off a sheet. The pay was double my last field rate, not a little better. Double. For 6 months. I signed the same day it arrived. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not that I signed. I needed the money and the work was in my field, and there's no version of that situation where I say no. What I keep coming back to is that I didn't even wait a day. Didn't call anybody about it. Didn't look up the site. Just signed and sent it back and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for a while. I've been doing geologic survey and site documentation work since I was 24. That's 8 years of access roads, legacy infrastructure, old mines, contaminated soil, rusted out everything. You learn to read a site the way some people read faces. Not consciously, just pattern recognition that happens before you decide to do it. Age of metal, rate of oxidation, how something weathers versus how something corrodes versus how something just gets left alone and slowly becomes part of the ground around it. That background matters for what I'm about to tell you. I want to be clear about that up front. What I noticed at Shaft 7 on the first morning was not a dramatic discovery. It was a small thing. The kind of small thing that a person with my particular job and my particular 8 years of looking at old infrastructure would notice, and that most other people would walk right past. I almost walked past it myself. Almost. Mark Skinner was already on site when I pulled in. He'd driven down from Denver, which is about a 6-hour run depending on where you pick up the highway, and he'd gotten there the evening before and set up camp and was already drinking coffee when I arrived just after 7 in the morning. Mark was the kind of guy who was just always slightly ahead of where you expected him to be, not in an annoying way, just competent. He'd been doing geologic tech work longer than me, and he had that quality some field people get where they don't waste motion. Every movement has a purpose. He handed me a coffee without me asking, and said the access road past mile marker 12 was rough, and had I brought the floor mats up from under the seats, because the truck was going to take some abuse. I had not brought the floor mats up. I did it then. The Happy Jack Mine Complex sits at the end of BLM access roads that don't show up on anything you'd find on your phone. Not a privacy thing exactly. More that the roads were put in for operational use in the 70s, and nobody ever saw a reason to update the consumer data. You know, they're there if you have the BLM field maps, which we did, but if you were just driving around San Juan County looking at your phone, you'd see nothing. Just mesa. Just red rock and juniper and the kind of silence that has weight to it. That silence was the first thing I noticed. Not unusual for that part of Utah, but complete. The kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. We split the site between us the way you do. Divided the grid on paper the night before, assigned quadrants, set check-in times. Mark took the east section of the complex, the older mill infrastructure, and I took the west side working south, which included the shaft cluster. There were 9 shafts documented in the original BLM site records, most of them capped in the mid-80s when the mine went into remediation status. Standard uranium legacy site stuff. Cap the shafts, monitor for radon, do periodic documentation, keep the paperwork current. I worked through the first 7 shafts in about 4 hours. Concrete caps in various states of weathering. Surrounding hardware oxidized to varying degrees depending on exposure and aspect. Ventilation screens either collapsed or missing entirely. Access signage faded to the point where you could barely read the danger lettering. Everything exactly as old as it should have been. I was photographing and logging and not thinking much about any of it, which is how that kind of work goes. You get into a rhythm. Your hands do the job and your brain goes somewhere else. Shaft 7 was at the south end of my grid, set back maybe 30 feet from the mesa edge. The concrete cap was standard, poured in place, slightly domed, cracked along the southeast quarter in a way that matched the freeze-thaw pattern I'd been seeing all morning. The surrounding collar hardware was what you'd expect. Bolt head swollen with rust, anchor plate corroded to the point where the original galvanizing was completely gone. A section of perimeter fencing that had pulled loose from its post and was just lying flat in the dirt. I crouched down to photograph the cap's cracking pattern, and that's when I saw the hatch. It was set into the cap itself. Not unusual, some of the older shafts had maintenance access hatches built in, and it had a steel frame and a pair of heavy hinges, and those hinges were clean. Not clean like someone had come out here with a rag and wiped them down, clean like they had never been left alone long enough for the oxidation to take hold. There was no rust, no surface pitting, no discoloration. The steel had a kind of dull, working sheen to it, the kind metal gets when it's handled regularly, when it sees use. Everything within 10 feet of that hatch was 40 years of neglect and weather. The hinges were not. I stood up and looked at them for a moment. Then I crouched back down and looked again. The gap between the hatch frame and the cap showed a bead of sealant that was... I want to be careful about this, because I'm not a materials chemist and I was eyeballing it. Recent. Not 1987 recent. Recent. The sealant had that slight surface flexibility that goes away after a few years of UV exposure. This stuff still had give to it. I took 6 photographs. Close-ups of both hinges, the sealant line, the contrast between the hatch hardware and the surrounding collar. Good, clean images. I tagged them in the survey log under general site documentation, just folded them into the standard photo record without a flag, without a note, without anything that would pull attention to them. I knew what flagging an anomaly meant. It meant a DOE inspection review. It meant the contract timeline blowing out. It meant the completion bonus disappearing, which was 1/3 of the total pay, which was money I had already mentally allocated to things I needed it for. So I tagged the photos, closed the log, stood up, and moved on. I carried those hinges with me for the rest of the day, not consciously. I wasn't sitting there turning them over in my head while I finished the grid. It was more like they were just there, in the background, the way a sound is there after it stops. The absence of rust where rust should have been. The sealant with give still in it. The quiet understanding, not yet fully formed, that something about Shaft 7 did not match the age of everything around it. I didn't say anything to Mark that night. We ate and went over the next day's grid, and I didn't mention it. I don't know what I would have said anyway. The first night I slept fine. That's the thing I keep coming back to. First night was nothing. Wind off the mesa. The usual joint stiffness from sleeping on ground that doesn't give. The kind of tired that comes from a full day of field documentation. I was out by 9 and up at 6, and I didn't feel anything. I want to be clear about that because it matters for what came next. Second night was different. I woke up at 3 in the morning, and for a second I didn't know why. No sound I could identify. No wind shift. Just awake. The way you get sometimes when something has already happened and your body registered it before your brain caught up. I lay there in the bag and tried to locate what had pulled me out of sleep, and that's when I noticed it wasn't a sound at all. Not exactly. It was more like pressure. A rhythm in the ground coming up through the tent floor, through the sleeping pad, into my back and shoulders, slow and even. Not mechanical, not like a pump or a generator. Those have a quality to them, a metallic regularity. This was lower than that, deeper. The kind of thing you feel in your sternum more than you hear with your ears. I checked my watch. 3:02. I lay there and I counted the pulses without meaning to. My brain just started doing it, the way it does when you're half awake and something is happening that you can't immediately categorize. The rhythm was maybe one pulse every 4 or 5 seconds, not fast, not urgent, just steady and deep and coming from below. At 3:14 it stopped, not faded out, not slowed down, stopped. One pulse, and then nothing. And the nothing was so complete it felt like something had been cut. I don't have a better way to say it than that. The silence after was louder than the sound had been, if that makes any sense, which I know it doesn't, but that's what it felt like. I was more awake in the silence than I had been during the percussion. I lay there until 4:30, and then I gave up on sleeping and sat outside until the sky started going gray. I didn't say anything to Mark over breakfast. He seemed fine. He ate his food and talked about the grid section we were finishing that day, and I nodded along and drank bad coffee and watched him for any sign that he had felt it too. Nothing. Either he'd slept through it or I was the only one it had reached, and I couldn't figure out which possibility bothered me more. Third night, 3 in the morning. Same thing. Same rhythm. Same depth to it. Same stop at 3:14. That's when I stopped trying to explain it away. I had been running through the list, the way you do. Seismic activity. San Juan County sits on geology that doesn't exactly lend itself to that, but it's not impossible. Old infrastructure settling. Pipes or voids shifting under temperature change. Some kind of equipment on a timer somewhere in the complex. I had been through all of it, and none of it held up. Not against that specific rhythm. Not against the stop at exactly the same minute 2 nights running. Equipment doesn't stop at 3:14. Settling doesn't have a pulse. I knew I wasn't going to log it. That was already decided, the same way the hinge photos had been decided. I had looked at the situation and done the math, and the math said, keep it out of the official record. An acoustic anomaly at Shaft 7, logged and dated, would bring exactly the kind of attention that ends contracts. I had seen it happen to other guys on other jobs. One flag in the documentation and suddenly there's a review. And the review takes 6 weeks, and 6 weeks in, the contracting agency decides it's cleaner to reissue the survey under a different team, and you're out with a partial payment and a gap in your work history. I wasn't doing that. But I wasn't going to do nothing either. I had a field audio recorder in my kit. A Zoom H-series unit I used for logging site condition notes when I didn't want to stop and write. Good frequency response, decent low-end capture. I pulled it out the 3rd night after the percussion stopped, sat outside the tent for a while thinking about it, and then walked it out to about 40 feet from Shaft 7's concrete cap and set it down on a flat piece of rock and pointed it at the ground and left it running. I did that every night after that. Separate drive, kept in my personal kit bag, nothing touching the official documentation. It took me 4 days of recordings and a couple of hours cross-referencing the audio files on my laptop to get a number I trusted. The peak frequency the recorder was capturing was 18.98 hertz. I sat with that number for a while. 18 hertz is below the threshold of human hearing. You can't hear it the way you hear a voice or a motor. You feel it, or more accurately, your body responds to it without your conscious participation, which is a different thing. I had come across references to infrasound in fieldwork contexts before. There's literature on it going back to the 90s. Acoustic researchers and a few environmental studies, the kind of thing that circulates in technical reading without ever quite making it into mainstream conversation. So I knew enough to know what I was looking at when the frequency came back. I pulled what I had saved on my laptop and spent an evening going through it more carefully than I had the first time I read it. 18.98 hertz. That specific frequency, not 18, not 19, that particular number, shows up in acoustic research as the frequency most consistently associated with a specific cluster of effects. Dread. The clinical literature uses that word without apology. Involuntary eye vibration, which produces visual disturbances at the periphery. And peripheral hallucination of presence. The sensation that something is in the room with you, or outside the tent, or just at the edge of what you can see, and that it is watching you. Every night after dark since the second night, I had felt watched. I had written it off, told myself it was the isolation, the unfamiliar sight, the particular quality of silence that high desert gets after the temperature drops. I had been on enough remote assignments to know that your brain does things in that kind of quiet. Manufactures company, fills in the edges. I had been chalking it up to that and moving on. I wasn't chalking it up to that anymore. Something beneath Shaft 7 was producing a frequency that the human nervous system reads as threat, not randomly, at 18.98 hertz specifically, which is not a frequency you arrive at by accident. That is a number that means something in acoustic terms, and whatever was generating it at that number. And it ran on a schedule, and it stopped at 3:14, and it had been doing this long enough that Jim Dean, whose name I didn't know yet, not for another week, had probably lain in a tent on this same mesa and felt the same thing and not known what to call it either. I kept recording, every night. The percussion kept stopping at 3:14. The feeling of being watched from outside the tent kept arriving after dark and staying until dawn. I didn't add a word of any of it to the official report. I didn't tell Mark. I don't have a clean explanation for why I didn't tell Mark. Part of it was the same calculation I'd been running since the Hinge photos. The fewer people who knew about a thing, the fewer people who could accidentally surface it in a way that cost both of us the contract. Part of it was something else I'm less comfortable naming. Something about the number 18.98 and what it meant that I had been feeling exactly what that frequency was designed to produce, and the fact that whatever was producing it was 40 feet from where I slept every night. I think I needed to sit with that alone for a while before I handed it to anybody else, even Mark. So I sat with it, and I kept the recorder running, and I waited to see what else there was to find out. Week 3 was when Mark pulled me aside. It was a Tuesday, I think, or close enough to Tuesday that it doesn't matter. We'd been working the eastern grid that morning, documenting a collapsed ventilation structure about 300 yards from Shaft 7, and I remember the light being flat and white and the kind of hot that sits on you without moving. Mark had been quiet most of the morning, not his usual quiet, which was just the comfortable kind of silence two people fall into after enough days in the field together. This was the other kind. The kind where somebody is deciding something. He waited until we were eating lunch in the cab of his truck, with the engine off and the windows cracked, which is a thing we did when the wind picked up enough to blow grit into everything. He reached behind the seat without saying anything, and came back with a folded piece of paper, not from a notebook. A photocopy, the kind that's been run through a machine that needed its toner replaced, slightly gray where it should have been white, the text a little soft at the edges. He set it on the center console between us and went back to eating his sandwich. I looked at it for a second before I picked it up. It was a DOE incident report. 1 page, standard federal form layout, the kind I'd seen before on other job sites when inspections turned up something worth noting. The date at the top was from 2019. The technician listed in the filed by field was a name I didn't recognize at first. James H. Dean, Geologic Survey Technician, Federal Contractor Certification Number redacted with a black bar, Site Designation, Happy Jack Mine Complex, San Juan County, Utah. Survey grid reference. The same grid designation we'd been working for 3 weeks. The anomaly description was about 4 lines long. Subsurface acoustic event, Shaft 7 vicinity, recurring, consistent timing, frequency characteristics outside standard geological parameters. That was the language. Outside standard geological parameters, which is how you write something in a federal form when you don't have a clean category for it, and you're trying not to sound like you've lost your mind. I read it twice. "Where'd you get this?" I said. "Guy I know at the Denver field office," Mark said. "Don't ask more than that." I didn't. There was a second page listed in the form's header. page 1 of 2. I flipped the photocopy over, thinking maybe the back was page 2, but it was blank. I looked at Mark. "That's all he sent," Mark said. "Page 2 was redacted." Not partially redacted, not a few lines blacked out. Redacted under a DOE stamp, full page, dated 6 days after the incident report was filed. Whatever Dean had actually found, whatever he'd written down in enough detail to fill a second page, was gone. Had been gone since 2019. I set the paper back on the console and looked out the windshield at the collapsed ventilation structure we'd been documenting all morning. "What happened to him?" I said. "Dean, medical discharge," Mark said. "Federal contractor certification revoked. After that, nothing. My guy couldn't find a forwarding address, no active certifications, no subsequent contract work anywhere in the BLM or DOE systems." Medical discharge. That's a thing that can mean a lot of different things depending on who's using it and why. In a standard civilian context, it means somebody got sick or hurt and couldn't continue. In a federal contractor context, in my experience, it can mean the same thing, or it can mean somebody needed a clean administrative mechanism to remove a person from a situation without creating a paper trail that looked like anything other than routine personnel management. I didn't say that out loud. I just thought it, sitting there in Mark's truck with the grit ticking against the windshield. That afternoon, after we wrapped the ventilation structure documentation and Mark had gone to start the equipment inventory, I pulled up my GPS logs on my field laptop and cross-referenced the date from Dean's incident report against the survey coordinates. It took me about 12 minutes. The incident date, the grid reference, the shaft designation, it all centered exactly where I'd been putting my recorder every night for 3 weeks. Same location, same shaft, same stop time, if Dean's consistent timing language meant what I thought it meant. What Dean had heard in 2019 was what I'd been capturing since week 1. The same thing, years apart, at the same 40-foot circle of cracked concrete on the same mesa. That's not a coincidence you explain away. That's a pattern. And patterns don't care whether you're ready for them. I sat with the laptop open for a while after that, without doing anything useful. The thing about the frequency data I'd been sitting on, the 18.98, the 3 weeks of audio, all of it on the private drive, was that it now had a predecessor. Dean had been here. Dean had noticed. Dean had done the thing I hadn't done, which was file it officially, put his name on it, hand it to the agency, and the agency had stamped a black rectangle over whatever he'd found and pulled his certification. And that was the last anyone had a record of James H. Dean doing anything at all. I'm not saying I drew a straight line between those facts right then. I'm saying I noticed them sitting next to each other, and I didn't like how they fit. I found a phone number for a Jennifer Dean in Durango through a basic public record search. It took me 2 tries to find a listing that matched. There were a few Jennifer Deans in Colorado and one in New Mexico, but the Durango one had a secondary listing that cross-referenced a James Dean at the same address from before 2019, and that was close enough. She picked up on the 4th ring. I told her I was a geologic technician doing survey work in San Juan County, and that I'd come across her brother's name in some site documentation and was trying to get some context. I kept it vague. I wasn't sure how much she knew or how much she'd want to know. There was a pause on the line. "Jim," she said, not a question, just the name, like she was placing it. "Yes, ma'am." Another pause. "I haven't talked to Jim since 2019, she said. Her voice was soft, a little strained, the kind of voice that's been asked this question before and has made peace with giving an answer that doesn't fully satisfy. "We had some family stuff going on around then, and I always figured he just, needed some distance. Has he been in contact with anyone else in the family that you know of?" "Not that I've heard." She paused again. "Is something wrong?" I told her I was just doing routine background research on prior site contractors and that I appreciated her time, which was a lie, but it was a lie that didn't cost her anything, and the truth would have cost her more than I had any right to spend. She said, "Okay," and we hung up, and I sat in the truck for a while after that with the phone in my hand. Jim Dean had filed an honest report. He'd put his name on it. He'd described what he found at Shaft 7 in enough detail to fill 2 pages of a federal form, and 6 days later, the second page was a black rectangle, and his certification was gone, and his sister in Durango had spent 4 years telling herself he was just avoiding the family. 3 facts. A prior technician, an erased finding, a man who'd stopped existing in any traceable way shortly after he'd done the one thing I had been very carefully not doing, which was tell someone official what was coming up from that shaft at night. I put the phone in my pocket and went back to the equipment inventory. I didn't say anything to Mark about the phone call. I didn't add anything to the official report. That night I walked out to the usual spot near the shaft collar and set the recorder down and pressed record, same as every night, and went back to the tent and lay there in the dark waiting for 3 a.m. The percussion started on schedule. It stopped at 3:14. The feeling of something outside the tent arrived sometime after dark and stayed until the light changed. I kept the recorder running. I kept the drive separate. I kept my name off everything that mattered. I thought about Jim Dean's name on that form, and I kept my name off everything that mattered. 9 days after Mark showed me the Dean document, I was running a depth calibration on the east grid when I heard a vehicle on the access road. Not unusual, technically. Supply runs happened. BLM maintenance came through maybe once a month. But the road to Happy Jack didn't get casual traffic, and the sound of that engine was wrong for a supply truck. Too smooth, too deliberate, the kind of engine that gets serviced on a schedule. I straightened up and watched the road. 2 of them. A dark Federal Plate SUV followed by a flatbed with something tarped and strapped in the bed. They came up the access road without slowing and pulled into the flat area near the equipment staging like they already knew where to park, which I'd come to understand they did. The 2 people who got out were wearing DOE field gear, dark tactical clothing, reflective access vests, the kind of setup that costs more than anything I'd ever been issued. The man was compact, fit, black hair, moved like someone who doesn't waste steps. The woman was a few inches shorter, auburn hair pulled back, sharp-featured. They weren't looking around the site the way new people look around a site. No orientation scan. No checking landmarks against a map. They walked straight toward the equipment staging like they'd parked in that same spot before. Mark came up beside me. Neither of us said anything for a second. "Federal," he said. "Yeah." The man came over first and introduced himself. "Gabriel Luna, DOE Environmental Compliance." The woman was Elaine Phillips, same office. Luna handed me a federal access warrant, 1 page, already stamped, and said they were there to conduct a scheduled subsurface inspection of Shaft 7 and that our survey work would need to pause for the duration. He said it the way you say something you've said many times before. Not rude, not warm, just efficient. The paperwork was in order. I didn't have a reason to refuse and wouldn't have had the standing to refuse it anyway. I signed the acknowledgement line and handed it back. Phillips had already walked to the flatbed and was pulling the tarp back. Portable winch system, compact motor housing, steel cable already spooled, anchor hardware, descent harness rigs. The equipment was well used but well maintained. No surface rust, cable looked recently inspected, everything stored with the kind of care that means you expect to use it again. Mark watched her unload it without offering to help. I don't think she needed it. What happened next is the part I've turned over more times than anything else from those 3 weeks, and I still can't fully account for how it made me feel in the moment. Luna walked to Shaft 7's concrete cap and crouched down at the east edge, not the center, not the obvious access point, the east edge, and ran his hand along a seam I had walked past every single day of the survey, and never once identified as a seam. He pressed something, or maybe just applied pressure at the right point, and a section of the cap surface shifted. Pre-cut panel. Maybe 18 inches by 24. It came free cleanly, no cracking, no resistance. And he set it aside on the ground, like a piece he'd set aside before. I was standing maybe 30 feet away. I felt my jaw do something it does when I'm processing information my brain doesn't want to accept. Sort of a slow clench, like I'm biting down on the fact. I had surveyed that cap. I had photographed that cap. I had run my hands along parts of it during the hinges documentation on day one. I had not seen that panel. I had not seen it because it was designed not to be seen from the surface, and whoever designed it knew what they were doing, and the DOE inspectors who were currently rigging a winch over the opening had clearly known exactly where to find it without looking. The clean hinges. Day one. I'd thought recently serviced, and moved on. Standing there watching Luna anchor the winch frame over the shaft opening, I understood that recently serviced was the wrong frame entirely. Those hinges were clean because the shaft had been accessed on a regular enough basis that oxidation never got a foothold. Not recently. Repeatedly. Since 1987 probably, or whenever the cap had been poured. Someone had been going into shaft 7 on a schedule long enough that the hardware showed it. Phillips got into the descent harness first, checked her own rigging, then checked Luna's. Luna said something to her I couldn't hear. She nodded once. They didn't brief us on what they were doing or when they'd be back up. Luna clipped onto the cable, looked over at me and Mark, and said they'd be a few hours and we should stay clear of the shaft collar during the descent. Then he went over the edge. Just like that. Phillips followed maybe 30 seconds later. Mark and I stood there. The winch motor ran for a while. Longer than I expected, actually, which told me something about the depth they were going to. And then it went quiet. The cable went slack in a controlled way that meant they'd reached a landing. Then nothing. The shaft opening sat there in the afternoon light with the winch frame over it and the cable disappearing into the dark and no sound coming up. We went back to work. I don't know what else we were supposed to do. Mark ran his afternoon GPS calibrations. I finished the East Grid depth log. Every 20 minutes or so, one of us would glance toward the shaft and then glance away. We didn't talk about it much. Mark said once, around 4 in the afternoon, "You notice they didn't ask us anything about the site?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Not what they found, not what we logged, nothing." I said, "Yeah." He went back to his calibrations. They didn't come back up that afternoon. By the time the light started going, I was watching the shaft more than I was watching my work. Their federal vehicle was still on the access road. The winch was still rigged. The cable was still in the shaft. I ate something around 7, canned. I don't remember what, and sat outside the tent until it got too cold, and then went in and lay on top of the sleeping bag with my boots on. I waited for the percussion. It didn't start. 10 past 3 in the morning, 20 past, nothing. The ground beneath the tent was quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet since the second night of the survey. I lay there and I thought about what that meant, the percussion being absent, and I didn't come up with anything good. The percussion had been a constant. It had been the thing I'd oriented my nights around for 3 weeks. Its absence wasn't relief. It was the wrong kind of quiet. The kind that means something changed that you don't have visibility into. 3:14. I know the time because I had my phone face up on the tent floor next to me, and I was watching the minutes. At 3:14, a voice came from the direction of the shaft. Single voice. Human. No echo, which was wrong. The mesa at night threw sound around. The shaft collar especially should have produced some kind of reverb from anything coming up out of it. This was flat, direct, like someone speaking at a normal conversational volume from the middle distance. No distortion, no layering, nothing that would let me tell myself it was wind or equipment noise or the kind of auditory hallucination a sleep-deprived brain manufactures in the dark. It said my name, my full legal name, first, middle, last. I did not move. I want to be clear about that because I've thought about it since, and wondered whether I should have done something different, whether I should have gone to the shaft or called out or grabbed the recorder or woken Mark. I did none of those things. I lay on top of the sleeping bag with my boots on and my phone face up on the tent floor, and I did not move a single part of my body that wasn't involuntary. My hands were flat against my thighs. I kept them there. I watched the tent fabric. I listened to the quiet that came after. The sky started getting light somewhere around 5:30. When it was light enough that I could see the shape of things through the tent fabric, I sat up. I pulled on my jacket. I unzipped the tent and looked out at the access road and the winch frame and the federal vehicle sitting exactly where it had been parked the previous afternoon. Gabriel Luna and Elaine Phillips had gone into that shaft the day before. Neither one of them had come back out. The winch was still there. I don't know what I expected. Maybe I'd half convinced myself during those last gray minutes before dawn that I'd imagined some of it, that the night had done something to my head, and daylight would sort the rest out. But the winch frame was standing at the shaft collar, exactly where Gabriel Luna and Elaine Phillips had set it up the previous afternoon, and the federal vehicle was still parked on the access road with its front tires sitting in the same rut they'd been sitting in since yesterday. Nothing had moved. Nobody had come back up. I stood outside my tent and looked at the camp for a while. Mark was already up, which wasn't unusual. He was always up before me, had some kind of internal alarm that I never figured out. He was standing near the federal vehicle with his hands in his jacket pockets, just looking at it. I walked over. Neither of us said anything for a minute. "You try calling them?" I asked. "Both numbers. Went straight to voicemail." I looked at the shaft. The winch cable was still threaded over the pulley and down into the opening, slack now, hanging without tension. Whatever it had been attached to was still down there, or wasn't anywhere anymore. I didn't let myself finish that thought. We tried the shaft opening first, called their names down into it, listened. The sound went down and didn't come back in any useful way. Not an echo exactly, more like the sound got absorbed. That's the best I can describe it. You'd expect some kind of return from a shaft that deep, but there was nothing, just this flat swallowing quality that made me not want to call down a second time. Mark walked to the federal vehicle and tried the driver's door. Locked. He went around to the passenger side. That door opened. He stood there a second before he reached in, and I watched him pull out a tablet, one of those ruggedized field units with the thick rubber casing around the edges, the kind you see on DOE and Forest Service crews because they can take a drop. The screen was still on. Battery must have been near full when they went down because it hadn't shut off. Mark held it up so I could see the screen. It was a GPS track log. 2 signals, color-coded, one blue, one orange, and both of them traced the same path from the surface down into Shaft 7. The depth readout on the side of the log showed the descent in increments. They'd gone down fast, faster than I would have expected from a manual winch, which told me either the shaft had some kind of mechanical assist lower down, or they'd descended under their own power past a certain point. The signals had stopped moving at 340 feet, held position there for 11 minutes, and then both of them just stopped. Not a gradual fade, not the kind of signal degradation you get when a device goes around a corner or behind a rock formation. Both signals ceased at the same second. The timestamp on the log put it at 4:17 in the afternoon, which was maybe 40 minutes after they'd gone in, maybe a little less. I stood there looking at that number. 340 feet. The deepest documented working level at Happy Jack was listed in the BLM site files as 280 feet. I had that figure in my head from the first week of survey prep. 340 feet was 60 feet past the bottom of anything that was supposed to exist down there. Mark photographed the screen. Didn't say anything, just held his phone up. Took the shot. Took a second one from a slightly different angle to make sure the depth readout was legible, methodical. That was Mark. Even then, even standing next to a federal vehicle whose occupants had gone into a hole and stopped producing signal 60 feet below the official bottom of the shaft, he was still thinking about documentation. I respected that. I also remember thinking it was a very strange thing to be respecting at that particular moment. I said, "What do we do?" It wasn't really a question the way I said it. More like saying something out loud to confirm I didn't have an answer. Mark lowered the tablet. "We should report it." "To who?" He didn't answer that, because the answer was DOE. And DOE was the agency that had sent 2 people into that shaft in the first place. And those 2 people were the ones who had stopped producing signal at 340 feet. Calling DOE felt less like reporting a problem and more like calling the people who already knew about the problem and had decided not to tell us. We didn't report it that day. I'm not proud of that. I've turned it over a lot since, and I still don't know what the right call was, but I know what we did, which was nothing official. We stayed at camp. We ate. We didn't talk much. The winch stayed rigged. The federal vehicle stayed where it was. The afternoon went by the way afternoons do when you're waiting for something you don't want to arrive. That night I set my recorder running near the shaft, same as always, and went to bed. I woke up at 3:13, 1 minute before the usual stop time, which was also the time the voice had said my name the night before. I don't know if my body had learned the schedule or if something else pulled me up. Either way, I was awake, and my first instinct was to look toward Mark's tent. The tent was there. The shape of it was there in the dark, the rain fly, the guy lines. But it was flat. Not the flat of someone sleeping low, but the flat of something empty, the way a tent looks when there's nothing inside it to push the walls out. I got up, put my boots on, went outside. Mark's truck was still at camp, parked where it had been for 3 weeks. His jacket was on the camp chair where he always left it. His field recorder, not the tablet, his personal audio recorder, the same kind I'd been running, a small handheld unit, was sitting on the ground outside Shaft 7's sealed entrance. The red indicator light was on. It was still recording. I walked toward the shaft. I got to within 20 feet and I stopped. I could hear something coming out of the recorder's speaker. Not clearly. It was small and the distance was enough to make it hard to resolve. But there was something. A sound. Not the percussion, not the subsonic rhythm I'd spent 3 weeks cataloging. Something else. I couldn't tell you what it was, and I'm not going to guess because I don't have enough information, and I've learned what happens when you fill gaps with guesses at this particular site. My feet would not move past 20 feet. I want to be honest about that because I've wondered since whether it was a rational decision or a physical failure. I think it was both. I think some part of my brain was doing the math faster than I could consciously run the numbers, and it came up with an answer that expressed itself as an inability to step forward. My body made a choice my conscious mind hadn't finished making yet. I stood there and I looked at the recorder and I looked at the shaft collar and I listened to whatever was coming out of that speaker, and I did not move. The sky started getting light. Not quickly. It never does up there. The mesa just slowly stops being fully dark and starts being something else. I stood at that 20-foot mark and watched it happen. When there was enough light to see the ground clearly, I walked back to my tent. I didn't pack it. I didn't break down anything. I picked up my keys off the floor of the tent and I walked to my truck and I got in. And I drove away from the Happy Jack Mine access road without looking back at the winch, or the federal vehicle, or Mark's empty tent, or the recorder still running on the ground outside Shaft 7. I don't know what was on that recording. I don't know where Mark went. I drove for 3 days before I made a decision about what to do next, and even then I'm not sure decision is the right word for it. It was more like running out of other options. 3 days in the truck. That's what it took before I could make myself go anywhere with a roof and a door and other people in it. I kept to the BLM roads mostly, didn't want to hit a highway and have to make a decision about direction. There's a kind of logic to staying on dirt roads. They don't go anywhere fast, which meant I didn't have to either. I ate gas station food when I got low enough on options, and I slept in the cab with the seat reclined as far as it went, which wasn't far. The nosebleed had started somewhere on the access road out of Happy Jack, and it hadn't stopped, not fully. It would slow down and I'd think it was done, and then I'd tilt my head wrong or reach for something and it would start again. I went through most of a box of tissues I found wedged under the passenger seat. I don't know how old they were. I kept thinking about the hard drive sitting in my field bag. Everything I'd recorded privately for 3 weeks. The audio, the frequency analysis, the GPS coordinates, the photographs of those hinges on day 1. Mark's photograph of the tablet screen with the tracker logs showing both of them flatlining at 340 feet. I had put all of it on one drive and kept it separate from the official survey report the entire time, because logging any of it would have triggered an inspection and ended my contract and cost me the completion bonus. That had seemed like a reasonable calculation at the time. Protect the income, document privately, figure out what to do with it later. Later had arrived, and it looked like 3 days on dirt roads with a nosebleed and an empty tent somewhere back on the mesa that I was never going back for. The thing about having evidence is that it only means something if you give it to someone who can do something with it. I knew that. I'd known it since the second morning I woke up to the percussion and started keeping the private recorder running. The question was always who that person was going to be. I didn't have an answer that felt clean. I just eventually ran out of road I was willing to stay on. I pulled into Monticello on the 3rd afternoon. The BLM field office sat on a side street off the main drag. Low building, government beige, a couple of trucks in the lot with agency decals. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for probably 15 minutes before I went in. Not because I was working up courage, exactly. More like I was trying to get the nosebleed to settle down before I walked up to a federal desk. I didn't want to bleed on anything. That felt important for reasons I couldn't fully explain. The woman at the front desk sent me back to Raven O'Brien without much ceremony. Raven had been my primary BLM contact for the contract. I'd dealt with her twice by phone before the survey started, both times brief, both times her voice flat and efficient, and giving me the sense that she had 4 other things open on her desk while we talked. I hadn't met her in person. When I walked into her office, she was already looking at the door, which meant someone had called ahead, which meant she knew I was coming. She was sitting behind a desk that had nothing on it except a phone and a legal pad and a pen lined up parallel to the pad's edge. Silver-streaked hair, gray eyes, a face that didn't offer anything, standard federal office clothes. She looked like someone who had been doing exactly this job for a long time and had stopped being surprised by what people brought through her door. "Mr. Ryan," she said. I put the hard drive on her desk. I didn't sit down first, I just put it down in front of her, and then I pulled the chair out and sat. I told her everything. Not in the order it happened, not cleanly. I kept backing up to add things I'd skipped, and at some point I realized I was talking too fast, and I slowed down. I told her about the hinges on day 1 and why I'd tagged them under general documentation instead of flagging them. I told her about the percussion, the frequency, the 1898 hertz and what that number meant. I told her about Jim Dean's redacted report and Jennifer Dean saying she hadn't heard from her brother since 2019. I told her about Gabriel Luna and Elaine Phillips arriving with the winch and the access warrant, about watching them work the pre-cut panel like they'd done it before, about the percussion stopping that night and the voice at 3:14 a.m. that said my full legal name out of a shaft that 2 federal inspectors had descended into and not come back out of. I said their names clearly. Gabriel Luna, Elaine Phillips. I said them twice, because I wanted her to write them down and she wasn't writing anything. I told her about Mark's photograph of the tablet screen, the GPS track log, both signals flatlining simultaneously at 340 feet. I told her about waking up at 3:13 a.m. and finding Mark's tent empty with his truck still at camp and his recorder running outside the shaft. I told her I'd stood 20 feet from that shaft and couldn't make myself go closer and stood there until dawn and then drove away. She listened to all of it without changing her expression once. No nod, no lean forward, no pen moving on the legal pad. Just steady gray eyes and that composed face giving me nothing back. I've talked to people who were skeptical and people who were scared and people who thought I was wasting their time, and I know what all of those look like. This wasn't any of them. This was someone receiving information and not letting me see what she was doing with it. When I stopped talking, she said, "I'll need a few minutes." She stood up, picked up the hard drive, and walked through a door at the back of the office. Not the door I'd come in through, a different one. She closed it behind her. I sat in the chair and looked at the legal pad, still blank. The pen was still parallel to the edge. I looked at the wall behind her desk. A framed BLM land management map of San Juan County, laminated, the kind they print by the hundred. I found the approximate location of Happy Jack on it. There was nothing marked there, just contour lines and access road designations and the blank indifference of a map that doesn't know what's underneath anything it's showing you. 22 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall and I needed something to do with my eyes. When she came back, she sat down and she looked at me and she said my contract was terminated effective immediately. She said the field truck and all equipment were confiscated as government property. Under the terms of the subcontract agreement, section something, she cited a number I didn't retain. She said the hard drive would be retained as part of an ongoing federal environmental review. I said, what about Luna and Phillips? She said that matter is being handled. I said, by who? She said, the appropriate personnel. I sat there for a second. Mark Skinner is missing. He's a civilian contractor. His truck was still at camp. Mr. Skinner's status is part of the review. That was the whole conversation. She wasn't rude about it. She wasn't cold exactly. Cold implies something being withheld that's usually there. This was more like talking to a process that had already completed its calculation before it walked back through that door. I stood up. I didn't shake her hand. I walked back through the office and out the front door and into the parking lot, and I stood next to my truck for a second before I remembered that the truck wasn't mine anymore. I stepped back from it, looked at it, took my field bag off the back seat. They hadn't said anything about the bag, and I stood in the BLM parking lot in Monticello, Utah with a field bag and the clothes I was wearing, and a nosebleed that started up again the moment I tilted my head to look at the sky. Everything I had documented. 3 weeks of private recordings kept off the official report precisely so they couldn't be absorbed by the same system that had redacted Jim Dean's second page. The one precaution I'd taken. The one thing that had felt like leverage. It was in a back room of a federal field office, and it belonged to Raven O'Brien now. I started walking toward the main road. I didn't know where I was going. There was a motel sign visible from the parking lot, and I walked toward it because it was a direction. The motel room was a 12 by 14 rectangle with a bathroom the size of a closet and a window that faced the parking lot. I know the dimensions because I measured them. Not with a tape, just walking it heel to toe. The way you do when you've been a field surveyor long enough that measuring things becomes something your body does without asking your brain first. 12 by 14. I did it twice. That's what the first hour looked like. The nosebleed had been going 4 days by then. Not constant. It would slow down to almost nothing, and I'd think it was done. And then I'd tilt my head or stand up too fast, and it would start again. I'd gone through most of the tissue in the bathroom and had moved on to folding toilet paper into tight squares and pressing them against my left nostril, which was the one that kept going. The right one had stopped on day 2. I don't know why I remember which nostril. I remember everything about that room in a way that feels like I was trying to memorize it, like some part of me understood I was going to need to account for every hour. Jackson had knocked on the door that morning. Second time he'd done it. He was the desk clerk, heavy-set guy, gray hair going thin on top, glasses with thick frames that sat crooked on his face. Wore a polo shirt both times I saw him, different colors. First time was a green one. Second time was blue. I don't know why that stuck with me either.
"Just checking in,"
he said through the door.
"Saw you'd been here a few days. Everything all right?"
I opened the door because ignoring him felt worse somehow. He looked at the toilet paper pressed to my face, and his expression did something careful and controlled, the way people look when they're deciding not to react. "I can call someone," he said. "Doctor's office is just down on Main. They take walk-ins." "I'm fine," I said. "It's slowing down." It wasn't slowing down. He nodded like he believed me, which I don't think he did, and said to let him know if I needed anything, and I said I would, and neither of those things was true either. He walked back toward the office, and I closed the door and sat back down on the edge of the bed. That was the second offer. After that, he left me alone. I'd been trying to call Mark since I walked out of the BLM office. 6 calls over 4 days, which doesn't sound like a lot, but each one took something out of me because each time I dialed, I was already building a case for why he wasn't answering. Maybe he'd driven out on his own. Maybe he'd gone to his own field office, filed his own version of events, and was dealing with his own version of what I'd just dealt with. Maybe his phone was dead. Maybe he'd left the site before whatever happened and was just somewhere, camping, not answering. People go dark sometimes for reasons that have nothing to do with a shaft in the ground. Except his truck was still at camp when I left. That's the part I kept running into. His truck was there. His recorder was sitting outside the shaft entrance, still running, and I had stood 20 feet from it and could not make myself walk the rest of the way. I don't know what was coming out of that speaker. I don't know if I would have been able to hear it clearly, even if I'd gotten closer. I stood there for 2 hours in the dark, and then I stood there for another hour while the sky went gray, and then I walked back to my truck and drove away. And that's the last I know of Mark Skinner. I've thought about that walk back more than I've thought about almost anything else. The tent I left behind, the equipment still sitting on the folding table, my second pair of boots, all of it just left, because packing it would have meant staying longer, and staying longer was not something I was going to do. There's a version of me that stays, that walks the last 20 feet to the recorder, that looks into Shaft 7 in the early morning light and figures out what happened to Mark, and what happened to Luna and Phillips, and what is at 340 feet. I've met that version of myself in the part of the night when I can't sleep, and I don't think he comes out of it any better than I did. The hard drive was what kept coming back to me. 3 weeks of audio, the frequency analysis, every photograph I'd taken, including the clean hinges on day 1, the thing I'd noticed first, the thing that had started all of it. GPS logs that placed every event at Shaft 7 with timestamps. I'd kept all of it off the official report specifically because I knew what happened to things that went into official reports. Jim Dean had put his findings into an official report, and the second page had been redacted under a DOE stamp 6 days later, and Jim Dean himself had not been heard from since 2019. His sister thought he was avoiding the family. That's what she'd said on the phone, and the way she said it told me she'd been telling herself that for years, because the alternative was something she couldn't carry. I had been careful. That was the thing I kept turning over. I had been careful in a way that felt, at the time, like it was protecting me, kept the recordings private, compiled everything on a separate drive, didn't log a single anomaly in the official report. I had held on to that drive for 3 weeks like it was the one thing standing between me and whatever had happened to Jim Dean, and then I had walked into a federal field office and put it on a desk because I didn't know what else to do with 2 missing inspectors and a partner who had vanished, and a voice that had said my full legal name in the dark. Raven O'Brien had gone into the next room for 22 minutes. I'd counted those too. When she came back, she was the same as when she'd left. No expression I could read. Nothing that told me whether she'd been on the phone or just sitting in a chair thinking about how to word what came next. She told me the contract was terminated. She told me the truck and equipment were confiscated. She told me the drive would be retained as part of an ongoing federal environmental review. I don't know what that phrase means. I've been thinking about it for 4 days, and I still don't know whether it means something is actually being reviewed or whether it's the language you use when you need to make documentation disappear without saying that's what you're doing. I had no copies. That was the other thing. I'd kept everything on the one drive because I was being careful, because having copies meant having more surfaces for something to go wrong. And what I'd actually done was build myself a single point of failure and then hand it to the people I should have been protecting it from. That's not hindsight. I knew it the moment she said the words, Federal Environmental Review. I knew it standing in the parking lot next to a truck that wasn't mine anymore. I knew it walking to the motel because it was the only direction I had. The nosebleeds started again around 4 in the afternoon. I was sitting on the bed with my back against the headboard, and I felt the familiar warmth and reached for another square of toilet paper and sat there pressing it to my face and looking at the water stain on the ceiling that was shaped roughly like the state of Florida, or maybe a boot, depending on how I tilted my head. I'd been looking at that stain for 3 days. I didn't know what Mark had done. I didn't know if he'd made a choice or if the choice had been made for him. I didn't know what was at 340 feet. And I didn't know whose voice had come out of the dark knowing my name, and I didn't know whether the nosebleed was going to stop or whether it was something I should actually let Jackson call a doctor about. I didn't know any of it. What I knew was this. Jim Dean had filed a report and disappeared. Gabriel Luna and Elaine Phillips had descended into that shaft, and their trackers had flatlined at the same moment. Mark Skinner had walked out of his tent at 3 in the morning, and his truck was still sitting at camp, and I had handed the only evidence that any of it happened to the agency that employed the inspectors who never came back up. The room was 12 by 14. The nosebleed was 4 days old. Outside the window, the parking lot was empty except for Jackson's sedan and a white pickup that had been there since I arrived and hadn't moved. I was going to stay until the nosebleed stopped. That was the plan. After that, I had nothing. No truck, no contract, no documentation, no leverage, no way to reach the one person who had been there with me. Every direction I could think to go led somewhere I didn't want to go, and some of them led back toward a shaft in the ground that already knew my name. So I stayed. I folded another square of toilet paper and pressed it to my left nostril and looked at the water stain on the ceiling, and I stayed.